Welcome to The Inside Story. I'm Billy Hollowell, and I'm joined today by Christian Post reporter John Brown, who's going to be diving into a really interesting topic, support for Israel and what's going on when it comes to younger evangelicals and their support for the Jewish state. John, how you doing today?
I'm good, Billy. Thanks for having me.
So you put together a really wonderful piece. We're going to link out to it in the comments so people can read it, but we're going to be talking through this today. And the title is Support for Israel, Dispensationalism Declines Among Younger Evangelicals. This is based on a study, but you went really deep in just getting a lot of expert opinion on this. Let's just start with younger evangelicals. What is happening right now with young evangelicals when it comes to their support for Israel?
Yeah, well, the Jerusalem Post noted earlier this year that a recent study by two academics out of Boston University and UNC found that support for Israel cratered among them from 2018 to 2021. So these two professors, one of whom talked to me, they presented their findings at Tel Aviv University earlier this year. And they found that about 70% of American evangelicals under 30 expressed support for Israel in 2018, but that number had dropped to under 34% by 2021. And also in 2018, only 5% said they supported the Palestinians in 2018, but nearly a quarter said they support them by 2021. So one of the professors told me that premillennial pastors are a lot older than amillennial and postmillennial pastors, and they're also less ethnically and racially diverse, which he thinks might be playing into this.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And obviously, we're throwing out a lot of Christian terms. Some believers might know what they mean, some might not. When it comes to premillennial, just give a little bit of a background on what exactly that term means when it comes to belief in the end times.
Well, there are different types of premillennialism, but basically all of them believe that Jesus is going to return after the tribulation mentioned in Revelation 7 and other chapters. And they also separate the second coming and the last judgment in different ways. So the famous Left Behind series portrayed what's called the pre-tribulational form of it, which teaches that the church is going to be raptured before the tribulation. Other premills think that the church is going to be raptured at other times during the tribulation, but the pre-trib premills especially believe that the modern nation of Israel was a major step in God's timetable for the second coming.
Yeah, and obviously this discussion about Israel's especially pertinent in light of what's going on in the world right now, because it will impact in some ways potentially what a person believes about the current conflict in Gaza, when it comes to Hamas, when it comes to the quest for a Palestinian state. It will color some of that discussion, obviously. And with young people moving more towards the amillennial and the postmillennial eschatology, let's just talk a little bit about amillennial, postmillennial there. Just help break those down. I know we've got a lot of terms here. We can kind of move on after that, but I think it's helpful for people to understand.
Yeah, it's very complicated. My eyes were crossing researching all this stuff, but basically, amillennials and postmillennials don't believe that the nation of Israel features much in God's timetable for the end times. Postmillennials believe that the church is going to be triumphant in this world and that Jesus is going to return after that. But amillennials believe that the millennium in Revelation 20 is symbolic and that we've been in the end times since the first century, basically. So both schools of thought believe that the second coming and the last judgment are going to take place at the same time, which is not what the premills believe.
Yeah, the amillennials essentially are waiting for the second coming right now. You're in the end times. There's not going to be essentially this 1,000 year, literal reign of Christ on earth. There's just going to be sort of the second coming. Would that be accurate?
Yeah. Hmm.
The post-millennial perspective, just to sort of, add on to that a little bit, they would essentially believe that, Jesus's return when he comes, that the church is ready and that the world has sort of gotten to a better place. The church has impacted the world so much that things improve, essentially, right?
Yeah, they post mills believe that well, basically, we will usher in the kingdom of heaven in some way, and when Christ returns, he will find an earth that has been dominated by Christianity. So the millennium, in a way, is like a symbol of Christian dominance on the earth, which I personally I find that hard to believe, but I do respect people that believe it.
Yeah, it's interesting the connections because the pre-mill and the ah-mill would probably share more in the things may not get better, right? The pre-mills, they believe things are going to get worse. Obviously there's a lot of conversation, which we won't get too deep into, about the Antichrist and, chaos and the tribulation period, all of this sort of coming to a head, before the second coming with, a rapture sort of mixed in there, as you were saying, somewhere along the line, depending on where you stand. Um, why do you think, just getting back to the generational divide, why does it matter?
Well, I think it's important because the way Christians in this country view Israel is going to have a geopolitical impact. Historically, the U.S. has been a key ally of Israel, and a lot of that support was because of evangelicals. And I think if evangelicals stop seeing Israel as a key part of the end times and of their faith, they might become more critical of that country, which could end up having a major impact in terms of how we treat them. But that remains to be seen.
Yeah, and there's so much there to unpack, but the numbers are, I mean, the numbers are pretty shocking when you look at the support that you sort of laid out. In the piece here, you had 33.6% of young evangelicals under 30 expressing support for Israel in late 2021, but that was 67.9% in 2018. And then, conversely, on the other side, in 2021, you had 24% of young evangelicals saying they supported Palestinians, up from just 5% in
Mhm.
2018. So, to your point, there is going to be, a potential impact on those views in the geopolitical sense. What do we think is driving these shifts and these changes?
Well, that's the question. I mean, I don't think we can really say yet. But I interviewed Dr. Richard Land, who is the executive editor of the Christian Post, and he's a premillennialist, and he believes the shift might be happening because there's an anti-Semitism problem at American colleges, which is obvious to anyone who's been watching the news. And he thinks that might have seeped into the church and convinced younger people to adopt eschatologies that don't emphasize Israel. And that could definitely be playing a role. But I also talked to Dr. Charles Hill, who is a theology professor at Reformed Theological in Orlando. He actually used to be a dispensationalist, but he said his studies convinced him that the amillennial perspective is what the early church believed. He came to believe that the land promises to Israel in the Old Testament were actually pointing to Christ and symbolic of his ownership of the world, and that the apostles believed this too, and that's what they were teaching. So I think there are a lot of issues playing into why younger Christians are moving away from the premill point of view, but it's going to take time to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think when people, go into the book of Ezekiel, for instance, and they look at the valley of dry bones in Ezekiel 37, it does become, you know, when it comes to Israel, complex, because you have what appears to be 1948, right? In some ways, I know there are different takes on what's going on in the Old Testament in Ezekiel, but I do think the big sticking point here for everybody that they do have to hash through is, what are the odds that a country would go away for almost 2,000 years and be back on the map again? How does that happen? What other country has that ever happened with? And I think we know the answer is none. So this Israel really is a central piece of the puzzle here. And I would also say, and I don't want to over editorialize here, it is strange that the entire world, it's not as though this country came back and there's no conversation about it. Israel is very much the centerpiece of most of the headlines, as is the Middle East, going on for the last 2 or 3 decades, right, internationally. So even longer than that. So there's a lot there to unpack. Did Just one other question for you, as you were going through working on this piece, because I know a lot of work went into it, did it shift or change your perspective or challenge your perspective at all, your personal eschatology?
It just convinced me that I'm not sure what I believe on these issues because it's so complicated and it's I often think that when Jesus came the first time, no one had everything right. None of the Jewish sects understood all of the prophecies correctly. So I don't think that anyone probably has everything right. I probably tend towards an amillennial perspective personally, but again, this is not about salvation. So I welcome any sort of debate, but I really just genuinely don't know.
Well, and I love that you said that too, because a lot of Christians get very upset on some of these issues. There's a lot of argumentation, especially on the rapture, but these are not salvation issues. They are important issues to talk through and hash out, but this is not the centerpiece of Christianity. It's a big piece of it. It does impact what we think about the world around us and theology. And again, it's important, but it is not a salvation issue. And so I appreciate you coming on the show and breaking it all down today.
All right, thanks, Billy.
Everyone else, make sure you tune into another episode of The Inside Story next week. In the meantime, head over to ChristianPost.com. We'll see you next week.